So Mark Bale, I believe, is running a little bit late.
I don't think he's up to be able to.
Okay. All right. Well, then he asked me to run the meeting. So I think we have a couple new people, right?
They will be appointed at the March 23rd meeting of the board.
Okay. So if you don't know Judy Houle, she's on board, right, as the interim super?
Yep.
Is that correct?
Officially as of March 19th, but
Okay.
right now,
Great.
trying to get my feet wet.
Good.
Unofficial now.
You're unofficial. Well, welcome. And we have Jen, right?
Yeah,
Great. Welcome.
yeah,
And
principal
Tom.
from East Meadow.
Thanks for being here tonight.
I'm going to be more.
And we may have some stragglers coming in as we move forward. We have a quorum?
Eight,
Yeah,
we
have
got
7,
8.
8. Yep. We're okay. Any old business to review before we get started? No? And I believe, Emery, you sent out minutes,
I have not. I did not get a chance to
Okay.
type them.
so we'll have to
Takes time for
we'll have to approve it next
Yes.
week.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just a quick note on the conversation that we had. I contacted Lillian, and she's available to help us. She just needs our meeting dates, and she's going to work around those. She's unavailable the April vacation week, but other than that, she is good.
I don't think we're meeting that week.
Good.
Oh, this was from the
But this is from
Yeah.
last
Oh, you were
meeting.
not here.
So
Right.
paying somebody to take minutes,
Oh, great.
She's
Okay.
actually a volunteer, but
and
not
she's going to
official.
volunteer, great.
Okay. Do we have anybody that can grab minutes tonight?
Not me.
No? Okay.
I can get one of the kids at home to do it. I have all my kids home.
No, he
No,
just
I'm
said
just
that
saying
Lillian,
Lillian.
he got
But I mean,
somebody
like
to do
tonight,
it.
if you want me to call them and bring
No,
someone.
that's fine. That's fine. Okay. So now I was not at last meeting. We agreed to meet tonight. Do we have a sense for how this meeting's going to go? Have you guys talked about that? Are we just? I don't
No, we have a very good sense. So there was some question as that we did not know how we got from the visioning session to the program that got sent to the in the PDP to MSBA, and there was an uncomfort level with the fact that we need to sell that to the community, and so we asked the architects, the committee asked the architects to come back and represent that material in a little bit more depth so that everybody had a fuller understanding of that. So
Okay.
that's the thrust of tonight's meeting.
Got it.
And
Okay.
pretty much the only agenda item we need to cover.
So are we okay to jump right into
Jump
that?
right into that. There's nothing else to change on schedule.
Great. Use really simple language. I will try. We are, it's been a long day for all of us.
Thank you.
Did anybody else not get an agenda? I'll just pass it.
So thank you everybody for coming back a week later. It's good to see you all. And Jared, your comment of using simple language, I mean, I think that's fair because we were meeting earlier with Isabelina and Chris, and we were throwing these architectural terms around like grossing factor. And please stop me if I do that, because this is what I do at work all day, and so then I come here in the evening and I use the same language, and that's not fair to you all. But taking a step back, I wanted to go through exactly what Alan mentioned, going from the Frank Locker educational visioning session and talking about the input we got from the district, and then the further input we got from the district and the MSBA, and how that translated into the space summary, and to just kind of take a step back and paint that process hopefully a little bit more clearly. I'll go into a fair amount of detail on what happened during Frank Locker's presentations and some of the conclusions that were reached. I hope it's not too much detail. If you have more questions, let me know. If you're nodding off, let me know, and I can, cut to the chase. But, it was something that we presented very quickly back in January, but I think to the committee's, to the point that we figured out last week is that maybe it was a little too quickly and we glossed over it. So it was a 2-day visioning session. At the visioning session were 15 teachers and administrators from both schools. On the first day, Frank had sent out some videos that some of us had been able to look at beforehand. Some of us watched after that day one. They were just YouTube videos. This presentation will be on the Dropbox account, so if you want to just Google some of these names, you can look at them too. They're just you know, it wasn't necessarily that this is what your school should be, but just kind of thought-provoking videos on what should education look like, you know, going forward in the next 100 years. Then I talked a little bit, and Helen talked about the MSBA process, just familiarizing the educators with the timeline and how it all works between the town and the state. Isabelina briefly presented on a snapshot of the Granby Elementary Schools, kind of grade configurations and sizes and all of that. And then Frank Locker went into his 21st century school presentation. Then people broke up into groups and kind of concluded on the most important issues from that presentation. We talked about what's working now at Granby, what could be better. Kind of had two tables going, two flip charts. And then at the very end of the day, talked about learning modalities and had everyone kind of vote on what the most important factors were going forward for this new school. So I think, you know, I just wanted to present a few of Frank's slides. He's a very gregarious fellow, has a lot of energy. His slides tend to resemble that. They're very busy and a little hard to read. So we got some help from Judy, and I formatted a few of them differently. But I think it can be summed up by, you know, I think the focus of 20th century education was more on the 3 R's, you know, getting the basics of education. And that is changing in 21st century education. And that's also changing how schools are run, that teachers are working together and not in isolation. You know, Frank spent a lot of time talking about case studies. You know, he's worked with districts across the country and internationally, and talking about some great project-based education. So talking about having the students really investigate a concept and try and think about it in many different ways. So, you know, in this example, what is the best capital to live in? And not only think about that in terms of geography, but think about that in terms of economics, and think about that in terms of population and demographics. And so not that they're going to master all of those concepts, but they're going to explore all of those while they're exploring the concept. So active learning, cooperative learning. And then, you know, how does that affect the built environment or the school that they're in? And really that comes down to teachers working together, right, trying to get planning stations throughout the school, flexible classrooms that are open and can be set in different, so it's not just all chairs facing the front of the classroom, but that the furniture is flexible, that there's multiple teaching walls in each classroom, that the classroom's not necessarily a rectangle. So you can't see them too well because it's a little bit dark in here, but we do have the plans out here of our 3 preferred options at this point. And at the very end of the presentation, I'll go through, you know, a little more clearly about how some of this background information was incorporated into those plans. Frank also presented on some of the research behind kind of this evolving curriculum. This is from a study in 2006 from the Conference Board. They interviewed employers of all different sizes in the United States and asked them what were the most important knowledge and skills for their future workers. And you can see up here in blue is kind of the old core academics. And this is kind of taken as a given. Employers are expecting that their future employees will have these skills. But what they're really looking for are these skills at the bottom: critical thinking, oral communication, teamwork, professionalism, and work ethic. So how does a school change their educational delivery to start addressing these items as well as these items, right? I mean, you can't just forget about what's at the top. I mean, I think reading comprehension is right there, close to the top as well. So a mixture of both. And then towards the end, I'm skipping a lot of Frank's presentation, but towards the end we talked about how does that manifest in schools, and that this was the example of a small school, a teacher in an insular classroom teaching their topic. And if you want a bigger school, then you just repeat that form. Whereas now we're trying to do a little bit more grouping, collaborative, so that there's a mixture of spaces, a mixture of functions that happen within those spaces, students that can break out of the classroom and learn in the commons, classrooms can get combined or broken apart, teaching planning happening within that space. And if you want a bigger school, then you multiply that into, or repeat that, that form. And so we haven't taken that, exactly as the way forward based off of input from the district, but we're trying to incorporate some of those concepts in our plans. After Frank gave that presentation on, 20th century versus 21st century education and some of the research and some of the philosophies behind it, all three groups wrote up what they thought was most important for Granby. And those are here, that we address multiple intelligences, prepare for 21st century skills, collaborative learning, facilitate that, teacher collaboration, new technology, project-based learning, and student-directed learning. So in the groups, those were kind of the key concepts. And then at the very end of the day, we talked about these 3 learning modalities, and everyone got stickers to vote on what the most important learning modalities would be for this future school. And there were 3 very, very clear winners, which were teacher collaboration, small group collaboration, and supporting social and emotional learning. So there's significant consensus within the group, which was great. We took a break. This was about 10 days later. It was day 2. We came back for another afternoon, and we talked to Frank, had everyone do some homework on a transformation and development map, which is very complicated, but I'll try and simplify it and present it tonight. And then he went through a bunch of examples of places for learning, school projects that he's been involved with, and schools that he's been introduced to, again, all over the country and all over the world. And then concluding with kind of figuring out an overall building relationship diagram specifically for Granby based off of the input from above. So he sent out this spreadsheet and asked that each team complete it. Basically, to summarize it, it goes from a score of 1 to 5, where 1 is kind of the most maintaining tradition, 3 is progressive, and then 5 is the most transformed. And so he gives little descriptions in here on what, how to define those categories. And so all the participants were asked to put an X wherever they thought they were now for under N, and where they wanted to be in the future for F. So perhaps now, it's possible that something now is too transformed and they'd want it more traditional. You could certainly go backwards. But in general, there was 11 categories with scores over 2.5, which meant that, in general, participants thought we were in here and thought that we needed to be up here. And again, those were pretty strongly represented across the groups. So those 11 were integration, that subject-based core learning, become more of an integrated core learning with exploratory subjects, 21st century skills, professional development. I've outlined in red the factors that have to do with kind of the built environment. That students be known by teacher teams, and that, we think a way to facilitate that is to kind of have small neighborhoods within the larger school. Adult connections, this was a strong one that I think especially Isabelina was a proponent of. Multi-generation community members sought as experts, tutors, and role models. Isabelina talked about, the senior center coming to the high school and having lunch, or coming to the grade schools and having a reading hour. And that some of that has fallen off, and that this is an opportunity to regenerate some of that enthusiasm. And then talking about the size of the building and the size of the classrooms, the spaces within it. Autonomous small teacher teams. And then just the last few, future-proofing, really trying to get flexible and agile spaces. Again, flexibility. And then social settings, central social gathering spaces. That learning doesn't just happen within the classroom. It can happen within the halls. It can happen while you're on your way to lunch. It can happen at lunch. And supporting that kind of social, emotional learning. I think, some to think about is this school signature and expression. That's something for us to think about, not necessarily in how we develop our floor plans, But as we go forward into, designing and detailing this building, I think that will be critical. And also the environmental impact, and really trying to get whatever environmental priorities we have with the building, trying to integrate that into the curriculum as well.
Christian, could you explain number 10 a little more, what that means?
Yeah, I think that in a lot of these, I think number 10 kind of relates also to, where am I? Kind of number 6 here, that the existing facilities feel that the teachers are doing the best they can within the spaces that they have, and they're oftentimes doing a great job, but that it doesn't feel like the building was built for what they're trying to do now. And so in this one, on number 6, that the building size and capacity feels almost circumstantial. And we have a special ed classroom that's too big, so we're going to put a divider in it and make 2 classrooms. The noise transmission is very difficult. It wasn't made for this, but we're doing what we can with it. And I think number 10 is similar but more of the, I guess a little more abstract in, that it feels like a cohesive school environment, that the building has a strong identity.
Or another way to say it would be that your beliefs and learning are reflected in the physical structure of the school. We believe in cooperation, so we have environments that facilitate cooperation.
Right.
We believe in teams, we have environments that facilitate teams.
So that was going through kind of the results of that spreadsheet analysis that had been homework beforehand. Frank then went into a bunch of different examples, ranging from pretty traditional school setups to very, new and interesting concepts. And not all of them were favored by the group. And I think that that's critical to understand, is that the district wasn't just, agreeing with whatever Frank was pushing. He was presenting some options, and the group of 15 was pushing back and accepting certain aspects and not others. I feel like this one in particular was this isn't a built school, but it was a competition in Wired magazine to come up with the perfect school. And the participants really didn't like it. They thought it was very busy, that it was too distracting, that there really was no sense of private classroom, which was fine. What was great was that all 3 groups, we were divided into 3 separate groups, really chose as their 3 favorites the same 3 schools, which was the Springfield Literacy Center here, the Trillium Creek Primary School, some pictures here, and the Blue Point Primary School there, which was really unique that all 3 groups came up with their same preferences. The Springfield Literacy Center was favored particularly because of the interstitial spaces between classrooms, that 2 classrooms were paired. So if I go back, that's this example here. So you have a classroom with this interstitial space. They had breakout spaces across the hallway. They have glass doors here where you can close it and just have a normal door into your classroom, or you can fold it all the way open, which is shown here in the photo, and really have the classroom bleed out into the hallway and feel like part of the hallway. The Trillium Creek Primary School, classrooms were arranged in small learning communities, and they had lots of small spaces for personalized learning. I don't have a floor plan of it, but the classrooms were kind of L-shaped and all clustered into these groupings with common spacing between them. And then the Blue Point Primary School, 2 classrooms joined by 6-foot wide pocket doors. And again, that was often these are kept open, and classrooms are kind of shared between those 2 teachers. Perhaps one of the teachers is stronger in reading and one is stronger in math, and so for those subjects they can divide the class up that way, or they can share resources. One can leave and the other can keep watch on both classrooms if they have to, so just allowing more flexibility. So then we finally concluded with talking about the overall building relationships for Granby in particular. And these were the strong points that came through, that it should be a community center, that the school library should be part of that community center, that classrooms should be somewhat formed in clusters to form learning communities. There was an idea that, because we had introduced the MSBA process, this day wasn't to come up with the perfect size classroom, but talk about how to potentially change or augment the MSBA spreadsheet to make it work for Granby. So while the library itself might be too big as one space, maybe you could take some of that square footage and drop it in little pieces all throughout the school to create smaller little reading nooks throughout the building. Teacher planning centers scattered throughout the building, not just at the front administration area, and flexible spaces, especially at for SPED classrooms. So taking that into the space summary, there's really 4 factors that we're looking at, and the MSBA is looking at. The first and most important is the educational program from the district, which was the write-up that Deb and Isabelina and then Jen and Tom also helped with. That how is education being delivered now? How does the district see that changing in the future? What are the priorities? And then looking at the existing facilities, both in terms of square footage, number of classrooms, size of special education spaces. Is that working now? What could change? And then taking the MSBA guidelines, they play a huge role. I don't deny that. You can push them. You can either go over or under on classroom size and quantity. You, in general, don't want to be extremely over or extremely under, because then you're going to jeopardize the funding from the state. But it's a give and take. And then, of course, the results from the educational visioning session that I just went through, really that had more to do with adjacencies, types of spaces needed, and how to work within the MSBA guidelines more than, your classroom should be exactly this square footage. I forgot I had handouts. These are the space summaries. I think we've passed these out before, but I wanted to bring copies again. So I think I made 15. I hope that's enough. This is pre-K through 6. You want to send those that way? That's pre-K through 3. You want to send those that way? So, does anyone want to have any questions on what I've covered so far, and Frank Walker and the visioning session process and all of that? Any clarifications, or we're okay? So, this is a pre-K through 3. This is a summary of what you have in your hand in pre-K through 6, the summary. And again, the 3 areas that I think have caused the most concern from the school building committee, and the 3 areas where we went over the MSBA guidelines, were core academic spaces, special education.
Oh, do we have the right one here? Oh, I'm sorry.
And then within our grossing factor. And both of them are similar. We went over in those same 2 categories for both pre-K through 3 and pre-K through 6. I'm going to take those in reverse order and go into a little bit more detail. So first I'll talk about the grossing factor. So grossing factor, I don't know if I think I skimmed over this at the very beginning, or maybe even never mentioned it, but what is the grossing factor? So grossing factor is the difference between the net square feet and the gross square feet. So the net square feet is the square footage of this room taken from the inside of the wall. And so this room, let's say, is, 1,500 square feet. And you add up all of your net square footages of all of the rooms that are on that space summary, and that's how you get your total net square footage. But in a school, the MSBA is concerned about the gross square footage. What's the outside of your exterior envelope? How big is your school going to be? And so there's a bunch of factors that are not considered within the net square footage. So a big one that we often don't think about is wall thickness. Wall thickness both on the interior walls and for the exterior wall. And that doesn't sound like a very big deal, but it really adds up. So for right now, for our wall thicknesses on these various schematic plans, I think we have 8-inch walls between classrooms, which if we go with a masonry building will be just about right, and if we go with metal studs and gyp walls will be a little bit too big, so our classrooms will be able to get a little bit bigger. Bathrooms are not counted, corridors are not counted, boiler rooms, electrical closets, etc. And then what was interesting was so that we again proposed a 1.4 for the pre-K through 3 and 1.5 for the pre-K through 6. And the MSBA came back with comments, which I was surprised that they put this in writing, but they said, please note that the MSBA will participate in a project up to a grossing factor of 1.5. Please confirm the proposed space is sufficient for the district to deliver their educational program. So to me, this seems that they're saying, are you sure that 1.4 is enough? We've done many schools in the past with grossing factors of about 1.4, so we do feel like that's a comfortable space to be in. I'm forgetting offhand, but I think that West Street right now has a grossing factor of about 1.5, and East Meadow 1.35.
Yep.
So East Meadow is a perfect rectangle, and the classrooms are, it's a very efficient building. And so that's one of the lowest grossing factors that I've seen on a building. But something to think about is that, if we were to do that building today, the wall thicknesses would be bigger. The bathrooms would be bigger, because those are all non-accessible bathrooms. The corridors might stay the same size, but they would probably vary a little bit more than they do now. Right now they're just all straight shots. There's no place to put a table within that hallway without blocking off your path of egress. So I think we're on the right track. Just for fun, we looked at, this is our proposed pre-K through 3 building up here, and we tried to get to a grossing factor of 1.22 with that same building. We didn't quite make it. It's a grossing factor of 1.3. But each hallway is just long and straight, 5 feet wide the whole way. No breakout spaces, and pretty claustrophobic.
So the 1.22 is not buildable.
No.
So
That was that.
To put that in dollars and cents, if I'm hearing this correctly, MSBA will participate in up to 1.5,
Correct.
right? Which means they're willing to spend a little more money, but Granby would have to spend a little more money too. We think we can make 1.4 work,
Correct.
right? 1.3 could possibly work, but it might be claustrophobic.
It would be claustrophobic, yes.
So there's a cost to Granby, because at the end of the day, everything's about cost in this town, okay? So there's a cost to Granby between 1.5 and 1.4, and at some point, it'd be good to know what that is. We don't need to know it now, but is it $100,000 extra? Is it 200? Is it 500?
Okay. Yeah, I get that.
Right?
Yeah.
The other thing is that, Christian, it seems like we are trying to interpret a sentence that MSBA returned to us,
Mm-hmm.
but it seems to me that we don't really know what that exactly means. Because when I read that, it could mean different things. It could mean that, hey, you could go down to 1.3. I'm just making up. But you could just change the dimensions of your net, and then when you gross it with 1.3, you can make your net larger. But when you gross it with 1.3, maybe you're getting to some size that is larger potentially. Well, it will be probably larger anyway.
Right.
Maybe that's what they're referring to. So my question is, I think you alluded to that, but the wall thickness, the bathrooms, shape and size of the corridors, and all the other equipment rooms and stuff, are they built to certain specs, or are they built to a minimum? Are they built to what the requirements are asking us to do? What was the consideration for those additional factors that make up the grossing factor?
Well, I mean, in terms of the size of the corridors, for instance, right? So a code minimum corridor would be 6 feet wide, but you don't have a 6 foot wide corridor in any of your schools now. And I think if you were in a school with a 6 foot wide corridor, you'd have behavior problems. It would be uncomfortable. I mean, it's more than just dollars and cents in one way, Joe, because it does affect your educational delivery.
Yeah.
So it can have kind of these larger consequences than you might think. So in general, right now our halls are similar to what you would find at West Street and East Meadow right now, about 8 feet. In some areas, I think we've gone narrower because then we expand bigger, so you get a little bit of that, squeeze and opening. Bathrooms, we have not looked at in that amount of detail, but yes, there are code requirements in terms of how big those bathrooms are going to have to be.
And bathrooms are important
an
in an
accessible
elementary school.
Stall.
Just want to point that out.
Yes. Right.
Possibly imagine.
I noticed it wasn't anywhere.
I actually don't have any questions on that. Let's get back. Are you going to talk about the basic square footage, the difference between 37 and 4 and the 39? And then I'm looking at the new PK3.
Yeah.
Before you go to that, can we have another comment on the 1.4?
Yes.
You made a statement a few moments ago that in the majority of the schools you've done, 10, 20 of them, and you've come out with 1.4 90% of the time. Am I interpreting that correctly?
No, I wouldn't say 90% of the time, but we have, I can think of 2 or 3 that we've done semi-recently that have been right around 1.4.
So it's kind of it's not something you traditionally know. 1.4 is a workable factor at this stage.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
And I think that's what MSBA is saying here, is that, they look at the statistics of all the schools that they're reviewing, and they're seeing that of all the schools that are coming through of an elementary school nature, that it's closing in closer to 1.5, depending on how the architecture is laid out. So that's what they're questioning is, you sure you can make this happen at 1.4? Because, we're seeing 1.5 as an average.
Mm-hmm.
So, and different architects design different ways, as you know, and you may have different site constraints or different program constraints on each one that can vary.
We're going on his track record that he has been successful at 1.4 in various cases. We're not nailing his feet to the floor,
Right.
But it's something that he knows has worked.
Right. And again, every building is a prototype.
Yeah.
There's not a cookie cutter here, so.
Okay, thank you. No, he answered my question. Thank you. Sorry, John. Go
John,
ahead.
your question, I'm sorry, was...
Yeah, as I said, I've got no concerns at all about the rest of it.
Okay.
The bottom of the page got total building net
Christian, he's looking at this sheet.
Yep, got it.
Total MSBA guideline.
Yep.
To 34
Yep.
versus your proposed of 37.
Correct.
And also the difference between the 31.7 and the 34 for the 2 MSBA. What?
Great. So that's here. I don't have that 31 number, but the only difference between the 31.7 and the 34 are 2 pre-K classrooms. And that's the only difference.
2 additional classrooms, or it's 1 additional?
No.
2
Two additional
pre-K classrooms.
Okay.
Because, so what we did is, if under the MSBA guidelines, where it says refer to MSBA Educational Program and Space Standard Guidelines, that's what happens when you just plug 215 into their spreadsheet. And so there are no pre-K classrooms because MSBA doesn't include pre-K in their spreadsheet. In talking to the MSBA, they will fund classroom space, but nothing else for pre-K. So we therefore copied that column over to the right, and we added 2 pre-K classrooms at 1,200 square feet each. So that's an additional 2,400 square feet. But what we didn't do is we didn't increase the enrollment number of 215. So our cafeteria is still the same size, our library is still the same size, our gym is still the same size, even though we have 2 additional pre-K classrooms.
So that they'll pay for the space for the 2 classrooms
Correct.
for the students.
But none of the support space.
Yeah, well, no support space. What's the theory behind that?
You got me.
Question.
Okay.
I think part of it is that often...
Updated the regulations.
Right, certainly that's part of it. Part of it is that often school districts will have a halftime pre-K, so they might not use the cafeteria. So I think that probably went into their thinking, but that's... So then the difference between the 34 over on the far right and the 37 is completely made up, is completely attributable to differences in special education and core academic. So I will now address special education, and after that address core academic. So for special education, we looked at what they have right now, at what we have right now at West Street. We have 4 larger, quote-unquote, special education rooms, 4 smaller group rooms, and 2 of these and 1 of these are all down in the basement, and then 1 larger OTPT room as well. And so that's what we have existing. If we look at what the MSBA guidelines are, again, this is not really under MSBA's purview. This is more under DESE's purview. So I would say, I can't think of a school that we've done where we have just met the MSBA SPED guidelines. I think they purposely put out a low number and then wait for DESE to address whether what we propose is right or not. But if you plug in 215 students, it gives you 2 large special education rooms about the same size as a typical grade 1 through 6 classroom, and then 2 smaller 500 square foot rooms.
What's the 2 little ones?
Those are both 500 square foot. One is reading and one is resource.
The itty bitty ones next to the big ones.
Oh, sorry, toilets.
Support to those large
Exactly.
spaces.
Specific toilets for those special education rooms. So each special education room will have a toilet within it. And then this is what we're proposing. In talking to the district and looking through how special education is being delivered now and how they see it being delivered in the future, they actually recommend larger special education rooms than what the MSBA guidelines state. MSBA says 2, really we only need 1. What we do need is many more smaller breakout spaces. So we have 2 at 500 square feet, and then 4, even smaller still, at 300 square feet. And then again, 1 OTPT room. And the reason for the smaller breakout rooms is because they're used by a lot of different people. English language learners, Title I, reading, speech, at risk, meeting with a social worker who might come to the school. And they can also be used by non-special education folks, any group that needs a breakout room outside of their classroom. Again, this is because of the district's goal of inclusion. You have typical classrooms with special education students that are normally included in that classroom, but at certain points of the day need to break out for individualized or small group instruction.
And it's more than just a goal. I mean, it really is required by laws, to have inclusion as much as possible in the least restrictive environment. And so what happens is we end up having kids, meet with the teacher at a table in the hallway that isn't necessarily, that's not the space made for it. It's not private. It's in the way. It's ends up being not conducive to the easement of the hallways. There's a lot of downsides to that too when they're pulling out kids at different times.
We're in the cafeteria, we're in the library, sometimes a couple of different groups working.
I'll throw in a phrase that Kristen used earlier in the presentation called future-proofing. And I think it's really a powerful term in terms of thinking about a building that will serve us for 40, 50, 60 years. I think Granby's average right now is around 50, 55 years for how long the buildings have been up. And when you think back, when this school was built, nobody had heard of autism. And now we have, two small-sized classrooms dedicated to just a program for preschoolers and early elementary kids. Schools didn't have programs for English language learners. We didn't have tiered instruction and early intervention. And again, who knows what's going to be coming down the road as the school becomes operational. So we really looked at the key phrases being flexibility, so that we can, adapt to what comes, but plan for what we know is already here.
Just a quick question. Based upon what you're proposing, if the needs changed, would those spaces be able to be repurposed for some other use?
Yes. That was,
And I think
our thinking all the way through.
Yeah, and I think as Christian said, these would not necessarily just be special education classrooms, because in the world of tiered instruction, the regular classroom is the locus of what goes on. You support kids as best as you can. If children are having difficulty mastering the material, you move them into what's known as Tier 2, which is a small group of 6 to 8 kids. They may have ed plans, they may not. They may be serviced, they may be just kids who are just struggling with reading but aren't diagnosed as having a learning disability. So they can use those spaces as well, quite easily for trying to be able to help. Same thing with the OT-PT space. We have people who don't work a full load OT-PT, but oftentimes there's adaptive physical education that goes on with students who are on Section 504 plans or have other needs that don't require an occupational or a physical therapist, but might have some adaptive physical education. So it's not like that room would lie fallow for hours at a time. There would be people in and out of that space, and having it large enough to be able to use the equipment for either therapies or adaptive PE is a really good thing to have happen. Plus you have to just also be careful with not being able to identify students with special needs in ways of, if they're in cafeterias and libraries and hallways, it's, somebody could pretty easily figure that out, and that's a huge no-no in the world of special education as well. So having those places cordoned off, a lot of these kids are like me, they are attention deficit disorder. So the less distraction, the better, so you can stay right with it. So.
So this is just a quick graphic at the pre-K through 3 level, again showing what we have now, MSBA guidelines, and what we're proposing. What we're actually proposing is slightly less than what we have now. Again, and it's a different focus. Just one large room, many more small rooms, but overall a smaller square footage than what we have now.
So can I ask, will DESE step in and reconcile the MSBA square footage versus what's being proposed, so that at the end of the day they are participating?
Correct. When we submit, I don't know, is it PSR that they? Or
PSR, yeah.
schematic design? I think it's PSR.
I think it's PSR.
I think when we submit the PSR, that we also submit a package to DESE, and it's a very specific package that you have the floor plans, but you take all the color off except for the special education spaces, and the feedback that the only feedback that we've gotten from them on our last few projects is that, one, we have at least one special education classroom that is the same size as a general classroom. We had a district that really just wanted all small group rooms. They didn't want to have any large special education rooms. They didn't see that it was necessary, but DESE pushed back and said, no, you need to have one, because we don't want to see you cramming students into these small classrooms if you have to. We want to see one that's on par with a typical classroom. And then the other thing that they've commented on is that they don't want to see all the special education spaces clustered in one corner of the building, which again is what we have here at West Street, with most of the special education being done in the basement.
So in this case, we have 2 full-size classrooms and a number of small. Is that right, or am I reading that correctly, or those 2?
Well, really, there's just one full-size classroom. The OTPT is kind of a different animal entirely. So looking at that in terms of a table form, again, we have 4 large spaces. I say large, that's over 500 square feet. This one will be much larger than any of those 4 individual spaces that we have now. 2 medium rooms, 2 smaller rooms, and 1 OTPT. So you can see that emphasis shifts from existing to proposed. Looking at pre-K through 6, it's very similar. These are the numbers of the special education spaces at West Street, and then these are the numbers of the special education spaces at East Meadow. Again, East Meadow has an OTPT room. They have 3 larger special education rooms, 1 medium, 1 small room, and then a couple very small quiet rooms, offices, things of that nature. When we go to the pre-K through 6, again, the emphasis is very similar to what we had on pre-K through 3. It's still 1 large 950 square foot special education room. More medium rooms than in the pre-K through 3 version. I think just 1 more small room than the pre-K through 3 version. Some quiet rooms and offices, and then 1 OTPT. So again, because we're combining pre-K through 6, we're actually getting much more efficient in terms of square footage than what we have now between the 2 different schools.
Is that because the services don't have to be repeated?
Exactly. So we have 2 OTPT rooms here, and we only need 1. We have 7 large rooms, and we only need 1. And then we have all of these breakout spaces to service that larger pre-K through 6 population. So that's special education, and that's why that category on pre-K through 3 goes from 3,000 to just over 4,000, and while on pre-K through 6 it goes from 4,500 to 6,400. Does that make sense for that category? Any questions on special education? Okay. We'll go into core academic. So similar exercise, we looked at existing for core academic. Right now there's 1 pre-K classroom at West Street. It services 3-year-olds in the morning and 4-year-olds in the afternoon. We have 3 kindergartens, 3 first grades, 3 second grades, and 3 third grades. With the current, these are the current enrollment numbers and the approximate totals within each of those classrooms. So you can see that, and we've heard this from the district, which I think has been supported by the school committee, is that in general, kindergartens at under 20 students per classroom is kind of a goal of Granby's. And then as we get older, classrooms up around 20 and maybe just a little bit over. But that smaller classrooms is the historic precedent in Granby.
Can I ask?
Yep.
Do we all have agreement with that?
Well, first of all, first question is, does the school committee agree with that? The school committee, do you know these things?
Yes.
Yeah. And
So
the school committee is all in agreement with
Yes.
with the guidelines?
Yeah, these are all explained to the school committee based on, again, educational needs and educational philosophies. Once we have a conversation and the agreements are done, then it's up to the administrators to work around those figures. But these figures are presented to the school committee and agreed upon by the school committee.
Great. And can I ask the educators, philosophically, you agree with what is being presented
The
here?
smaller you are earlier on, the more likely you're going to have children being able to master reading and mathematics. And if you don't master reading by the end of 3rd grade, it can be downhill from there.
And can I ask, if you were, not that this should be the most pressing issue, but if you were a parent outside of the school district and you were interested in school choice, would this be an attractive?
Absolutely.
That's a yes?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I had a school council meeting today, and we were talking about enrollment. We were talking about what we can do to encourage community to be involved. We were talking about what we can do to keep our kids here in Granby. And one of the parents said very, very firmly that one of the things that she loves about Granby is the small class size. Like, that is her direct words from our meeting today.
Okay. So we've heard from the school committee and we've heard from the educators. Everybody feels
And
the
all
same way?
school choice that comes.
So
they
now
come
can I
here.
ask this committee, do we philosophically agree with the numbers that are being presented here? Because I think that's a key issue.
Yes, I do.
I do.
I do.
It's fine.
Never had a problem with that. So it's always been that way for
Great.
years here.
All right, thank you.
So
This is no change from the current system, right?
this is the current
This is
system.
the current system, yeah.
This is the MSBA guidelines. Excuse me. So pre-K, like I mentioned, does not apply. Kindergarten, if you take the 215 students and divide it by 9, you get 23.9. So I think that's not exactly how they're. I tried to go into their spreadsheet and figure it out. I couldn't. But they're basically counting on 23.9 kids in each classroom. And they count the first through third grades as 7 first through third grade classrooms. So they're not thinking about how many first graders do you have, how many second graders do you have, how many third graders do you have. It's just that you have 215 students in this school. So again, 23.9 for those and 23.9 in the kindergarten. Oh, at the bottom. So just for the fun of it, I started pushing in different numbers, and just to show how arbitrary it is, if we had an enrollment agreement of 220 instead of 215, then the spreadsheet would have said 8 classrooms instead of 7.
Can I tell you, I have 218. So,
No recruit from Belchertown and bring it.
Southampton.
The other thing too that guides
That's my point,
pre-K,
where you get
which
to
I think people need to be cognizant of, is because our pre-K is driven by special education, because we have to start educating children at the age of 3. The regulations require that these children be educated with their non-disabled peers, quote unquote. So that drives a lot of what class sizes look like in pre-K. So I think where MSBA may not pick up on this, the DESE certainly will, making sure that we're compliant. And based on what I know about pre-K and the fact that space precludes 5 days a week for either group is concerning to me.
So this is our proposed, this is taken from, I forget which floor plan I just stole these from and scattered them here. I think it was the pre-K through 3. But 2 pre-K classrooms, 3 kindergarten classrooms, and then MSBA said 7 classrooms, and we currently have 9 classrooms. And we talked about this with the district for a long time, and they felt comfortable with the existing enrollment and with the projections of it staying flat or declining just a little bit, that we would go forward with 8 classrooms, kind of right in between. So just quickly go to these for, and then the table. I think what you can see here is, so existing classrooms, again, 1 pre-K and then 3s all the way down. And what would have to happen is that one of those grades would have to go to 2 classrooms. So it'd be up to the principal to figure out how to do that. If you have a class with a smaller enrollment, that works out great. If you don't, maybe you start thinking about having a K1 room or a 2-3 room, or switching it that way, but that the district and the educators felt comfortable with having the ability of having 2 pre-K classrooms at the larger size, having 3 kindergartens, again, making sure that we're addressing those students at the early age, and then having a little bit of flexibility as we go forward, and that 8 first grade through third grade classrooms would be sufficient for the district. So again, that was the kind of taking the financial implications into account, and not trying to overbuild, but trying to meet Granby's needs.
Over the far right, you've got 54 kindergarten kids.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't that mean the following year there will be 54 first graders?
Correct. So the important part on the plan is to make sure that that first grade room can be used as a second grade room or a third grade room, and that you can shift the school around to be flexible for that. So exactly, so for the next year, then all of a sudden you would have 2 second grade classrooms, and you'd have 3 first grades and 3 kindergarten rooms.
A similar thing is happening right now at East Meadow, where we have a group of, there's 4 fifth grades right now, but everything else is 3. So that there was 4 fourth grades last year, and there'll be 4 sixth grade next year, supposedly. So, we've had this bigger class kind of come through and adjusted classrooms accordingly.
And I think one of the key variables that we talked about at the beginning, but it's worth bringing back, is the concept of school choice. And that these numbers are all non-school choice numbers. MSBA won't participate in discussions on that. In reality, if we had 3 classrooms for every grade, we could probably fill them up with school choice students. For planning purposes, we can only get so close with that. At the end of the day, if we have 8 classrooms and we didn't have any students, that would open up the possibility to bring some students into the school. But it's unfortunate. It's too bad that they don't let communities think about that in the planning. But
doesn't the school committee on an annual basis vote the number of school choice slots per grade?
We decide on our own. Well, actually, we do decide on our
Yes.
number,
Yeah.
and then we advertise.
So if you
based
have
on that
a
number.
large class going through, you reduce the number of school choice
Correct.
slots.
At that grade
available
level, yes,
in
right.
that
Or
grade.
don't take any of
Yeah.
that grade level at all.
Yeah.
For example, if your kindergarten enrollment was to the point where you needed 3 classes, but they were going to be very small, you might add in a few school choice students. If it was lower, so you could fit it in with 2, you might not take choice students all the way through. Kindergarten and first grade are the primary places where students do want to come in. They will come in afterwards, but those are really the key transition points.
I'm not sure if it is what you're asking, John, but given that the 42 seems to be the outlier, if you have a few additional years with numbers around 54, let's say, then what do we do with this configuration? Then you can't really move students around. Are we then saying a decision has to be made and some grades will have to go with 20 plus students? Is that what it is?
Yeah.
And that grade that you're talking about, the 5th graders, I just wanted to bring up the history of that. Remember, the moms of the 5th graders were all a very vocal bunch. And it was found out through the community that they were going to take this 5th grade and they were going to put them into 3 classrooms. And
When they were going from 3rd to 4th.
when it was, right, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, it was from 3rd to 4th. So this large group, they're born in 04, they're 04s. Okay? So this large group of 04s have this vocal, strong parents, and I'm one of those parents, right? But believe it or not, I was not on this drive. I signed my name to the petition, but I was not leading it. They went, nuts, and they went to the superintendent and their meetings and everything else to make sure that their kids' class size wasn't going to be increased because of the lack of teachers. And the reason why there was a lack of teachers was because of lack of funding. It didn't have anything to do with building space. It was about teachers, right?
Yeah, it was around budgetary concerns, and people were worried that they were going to combine them together because of budget.
Because of budget.
Yeah.
Right. So the community will, it's funny because we all talk about money here and the budget's the bottom line, but we still care about our kids.
Well, and I think, Emery, your point was really like looking at, well, what if, are we really okay with 8? Is kind of, because you were saying, well, what if we have all 54s and we have high numbers and we actually need 9 versus the 8?
Yeah, and I understand the flexibility
Yeah.
concept, but it seems like there might be some situation where, because we planned based on those assumptions, we might have situations where the number of students per classroom may go way beyond whatever we desire to have. And then it may just change and shift downward, and some things may level out, but if we have this scenario, who says we're not going to have a situation where we have 50 plus students per grade in the future?
But based on birth rates and enrollment projections, which is what MSBA is looking at when they fund this, I mean, they're not envisioning we're going to be having classes in the 50s in the foreseeable future. Like that 54, for example, has a dozen school choice kids in it. That will come in cycles. In the next 40 years, we're going to see 2 or 3, birthing cycles that will go up and down. So who knows where it ends up?
So it goes to your point that the school choice numbers will be adjusted if the space is not.
Similar table, but pre-K through 6. As Jen mentioned, right, there's 4 classrooms here for 5th grade. What we're proposing for pre-K through 6, again, to kind of average out what the MSBA guidelines were versus what we have now, is the MSBA guidelines were for 21 classrooms. Currently between West Street and East Meadow, we have 23, and the district felt that they could do with 22. So again, within that pre-K through 6, within that 1st through 6, I should say, within that 1st through 6 grouping, ideally one of those classes will be in 2 classrooms and everyone else can be in 3. But if there's an extra big year, maybe one of those has 4 and 2 of them have 2, there'll be some flexibility. But in general, we're looking at 17 1st through 6th grade classrooms.
But I also think this is indicative of a trend that is in the Commonwealth, in that you're seeing larger classes of kids graduating from public schools in smaller groups, smaller cohorts coming in. There is an enrollment dip and a birth dip going on right now that will work its way through. So you'll see those smaller numbers coming into, and those larger numbers hitting the junior, senior high, and then exiting out. And so you will see probably some decline in enrollment as a result.
And we have projections for kindergarten from the census, and there's 35 Granby school students that will be coming in. So 35 is 2 classrooms.
And that's kindergarten.
That's kindergarten for next year.
When the projection study was done, how far back did they go? Was it a 10-year stretch, or do we know?
There was an enrollment study done that I've looked at that goes back 10 years. I also asked David for 10 years worth of figures because we want to look at it again and just see, how things stack up. So I've got everything back to 2005 right now.
But maybe I didn't say that the right way. So their projection is literally, they're going out over 10 years or so? Like they're projecting?
Not going out, but looking at history, what the trajectory is. There is a formula that is pretty well, or an approach that's pretty widely used. It's called the cohort survival model, where you look at birth rates and then ins and outs throughout the course of a span of 10 years or so, and then can figure out from there, looking at that cohort survival rate.
They've been pretty accurate.
Yeah,
Going
Tom, I
back
think you
years,
said
they've
that,
been pretty
right?
accurate.
Yeah, okay.
Everybody's starting school in the next few years, so I know.
So that is all I have for the explanation on the net square footage increases from Spit's summary sheet. So are there any questions on that?
It was very helpful for me. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming back a week later. Well, let me quickly go through. I just wanted to tie it back to Frank's educational visioning and the feedback that we got back from the district. I'll cruise through these pretty quickly, but that again, that a lot of that input we received didn't go back onto the exact size of the classroom, but it did go back onto the layout of the school, and these are very rough and they will change over time depending on which one we go forward with, but that we always tried to have a community part of the building that would be very public, that would be easy to be closed off from the rest of the building. We looked at, these are direct quotes from what the feedback was from the 15 participants, that they wanted autonomous small teacher teams within. So one way to support that is by scattering teacher planning classrooms throughout the building so that these teachers can share that teacher planning room and start developing lesson plans together and really make sure that they're all on the same page. Flexibility, you know, as we go forward, we'll talk about, do we have doors between classrooms? Do we have sliding doors between classrooms? Do we have, what's the best approach to having a flexible space while still preserving privacy and noise concerns? Student-centric social workspaces, again, you know, trying to have these informal, open areas where maybe, you know, half of this class and half of this class come out here and do a project together. Or this class comes out here and there's a little, you know, just one little riser for a stage, so that you can do an informal presentation in somewhere that's different than your classroom environment. These flexible kind of learning spaces throughout the school. Interstitial spaces between classrooms. This is something that we really tried to work out, especially wherever we're doing new construction. I would say overall, this list, you know, we're trying to tackle all of these items in every plan that we've showed you so far, whether it's been on West Street or East Meadow or pre-K through 3 or pre-K through 6. The only kind of constraint we have is when we're dealing with an ad reno situation at West Street or East Meadow. So we'll do the best we can to make all of this happen within this shell, but you know, we don't have quite as much flexibility as we do with a new building. Otherwise, I think we're trying to keep the same amenities in each school. You know, just a sample, again, this is the pre-K through 3, so the community space in front, the shared rooms, grouping classrooms together so that they feel like a little bit of a neighborhood within the school, these informal breakout spaces, teacher planning rooms, and then similar for the pre-K through 6.
Can you show me, you said a teacher planning room, where is that?
It's very hard to see. It's red as opposed to orange. But, so these are these small, there's one there, and we've got some, this one actually does not have as many as I thought. That are for pre-K through 3, so we have a planning room here and a planning room here. Again, this will get ironed out as we push forward, but here, sort of planning room, and planning room. So some planning might happen in the central administration, you know, front office, but that these areas have a small desk for a teacher to do private work, a small table for 2 or 3 of them to meet, and maybe a small printer is in there.
Okay.
So I don't think we have any questions on the options and the 3 that are left on the table at East Meadow. I am sorry to say that I don't have feedback yet from DEP on the septic issue. I know that was a big topic that was brought up a week ago. We are pushing them very hard as we dare without getting them to not like us. So I'll keep you abreast of that, but we definitely wanted to focus, as Don said tonight, on just this part in general.
Is everybody comfortable and understand it well enough that it makes sense and that you can talk to other people outside of this committee and explain how the thought process came about? Because that's important.
Yeah, that was great.
Thank you.
That was great. It really showed us how you got from here to there. And why.
You provided the missing link.
Good.
There we go. Now what it is the money.
Exactly.
But thank you. And a lot of work went into this, and I really do appreciate it.
I think it's important to take this step and step back a little bit so there's a good consensus of understanding.
And being able to hear from the principals and the people who do the day-to-day education. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Great job by the design team.
Yes, it was.
Thank you.
So next
Do we
meeting
have any other
is
topics for tonight, or?
Well, we can continue into discussion of the 3 options that we have. We have a schedule in place that we'd like to get the first schematic report, the PSR, into the MSBA by the 16th of April. It's a little tough to make that decision without having feedback from DEP on whether or not we need a sewer treatment plant. expensive item for one of the solutions, or two of the solutions possibly. So I'm not sure what we can gain without that information.
Well, the other issue I'm going to run into too is if you're going to require a lot of data on the part of myself or whatever,
Right.
very busy time.
Yep.
So we can't be on contact in a week
Right.
or have that last minute
Right,
document come
right.
in front of me that has to be filled out
Yep.
because I'm right in the middle of the budgets right
Okay.
now.
Good to
And I'm
know.
just letting you know that.
Yeah.
We have taken a look at the schedule and what the impact of the schedule is. That was brought up at the last meeting. And I don't have enough to hand out here tonight, but if we do not put the PSR in on April 16th, the way that the MSBA Board and Facilities Assessment Subcommittees stage out through the end of the year, there's actually there's one quick interim option, but it doesn't look promising. And actually, the more realistic schedule would be that the PSR would go to June 11th, and the Facilities Assessment Subcommittee meeting would be on June 24th, or July 8th. They take two. And the board meeting to approve that would be on July 29th. That would mean that then the design team really is reluctant, and I don't blame them, to go into schematic design until we have blessing from the MSBA at that Facilities Assessment Subcommittee that they have buy-in to this. There's a lot, there's a lot for us to digest. They have to digest it too and make a decision that it makes sense that they want to be, fund this and be part of it, and it's good for the community. I would see that if we wait probably about 4 or 5 weeks before we jump into schematic design till they make that decision, we probably will not be able to get approval from them for a project funding agreement until their January 27th meeting in 2016. Now, that sounds like a long time away, but the schematic design is a 3.5-month process that the design team has to do. We have to get estimates put together and submissions going in. It has to be reviewed in detail. DESE has to get involved before it ever goes to the board. So there's a lot of steps that take place in the schematic design phase. So what we're looking at right now is, without having information from DEP tonight to tell you, and everybody say, let's go to solution number 2. I think that's what we're looking at now is as much as I try to hold a schedule, I've put together a pretty rigorous schedule and cracked a whip or beat the drum to the design team to meet it, and they have to this point in time. But they're up against it with some unknowns here that we can't put before you to make a logical decision right now.
So I'm sorry, when do we expect to hear from DEP?
We're pushing them, but
When they feel like it. I mean,
I don't think we could go forward without DEP.
Well,
Very uncomfortable even considering a vote without DEP.
yeah.
but, excuse me. So what you're saying is, April 16th is the deadline that you would like this, we should hopefully make a decision by then.
Well, no, because what happens is we make a decision, they have work to do.
Right.
They have to take one of these 3 solutions and,
Right.
For lack of a better term, polish it up before it goes in.
Right.
With their engineers as well, and that's a lot of work in itself. So, that's going to take some
How long
time.
is it?
If in fact we can get an answer from DEP in the next few weeks, we could hit that interim suggested date that may get us to the MSBA board meeting by the November 19th board meeting. But we need information from DEP.
Right.
Like
But
next week.
besides the information from DEP, the board, we can still discuss, we have a lot of things to discuss about these choices. I'm just saying, I don't think that we should, just because we don't have information from DEP, we shouldn't as a group discuss our choices.
No, that's a good, discussion
Right.
on the choice is good, just as long as you know there's that's 800-pound gorilla in the room that could be a $3 million sewer treatment plant that nobody's figured on.
Right.
So far that may make your choice different.
Right.
It will make our choice different.
Will it make our choice? I honestly don't understand how.
I think it would. During the presentation last week, there were several options presented, and one of the options that was presented, that has to be reviewed, is we may not have to do any work to the septic system if we chose that option.
Oh,
And by choosing that option, we no longer have the million-dollar gorilla. And I think we need to know that answer
Okay.
before we go forward. That's just my personal opinion.
I agree.
think we need to know that. That would certainly affect my vote. I don't know
That's
about
good
the
to
others.
know, yeah. Okay.
Yes, yeah, the ad reno is probably the easiest option right now to say that you would have no increase, you know, I'm guessing.
Number 5, is it?
Right.
Yeah.
Number 5, right,
Yeah.
is also one of the costlier ones right now, but the other ones become less expensive if you don't have to do the sewer treatment plant.
Relatively speaking, yeah. So at the end of the day, what we're saying is that based on what we thought we were going to do before those DEP conversations and what might happen because of the delays, we're talking about 2 months delay, is it fair to say, from November 19th or so to January 15th? Is that what you were saying?
January 27th. What's unfortunate is the MSBA doesn't have on a regular basis every month. They're kind of like a 6-week schedule between their board meetings. So, you know, when you miss one, it gets exaggerated or exacerbated.
But I would rather wait if we're not fully ready to go.
Agreed.
I'm sorry, I just have to say that. I just don't want to get caught in the market.
Yeah.
Could we have a flexible meeting schedule for this group? We should be meeting as soon as an answer comes.
Yes.
We just need to post it.
We have one scheduled for next week, right?
Yeah, is
No, the
there
week after is the,
No, we have one for the
No,
9th.
next
So
That
going
was
back,
originally going to be our public outreach session.
and going back to the point that Andrea was making, we understand that we have this $1 million+ additional cost that may come in depending on what the decision from the DEP is related to the water supply and sewer, right, or septic system. But is there a benefit in us keeping a schedule and continue to talk about the other factors that impact the project? Or are we at a point where that decision is the only driving factor and we don't really have to worry about the rest of the project?
Well, it's a major driving factor, but it's a major driving factor more than just construction costs. If there's a sewage treatment plant, you people as a school committee are really going to have to buy the big bullet, because then you have to hire someone to do this and run it. So you're looking at something that's going to be a 20-year thing, not a construction cost.
Right.
So I think all those things have to be.
I was under the impression that the only option that needed the sewage treatment plant was option 7.
You get that impression.
Oh, at the last meeting now?
no,
No.
because the potential to have East Meadow School standing there still as an empty building and used for something would impact the flow.
Oh, right,
You'd have to take that building down to, you know, let them think that there's no potential for somebody to be in there.
Okay, right.
And we don't have that
Do you want a
factored
little
into the cost.
background, Joe, about this issue?
If you, yeah, sure, I don't want to drag the meeting down, but.
Right now, there's 2 septic systems, one for the senior high school, and one for East Meadow. And the good news is that the East Meadow one is relatively oversized. That from Berkshire Design Group's analysis, it looks like it was sized for a population of about 500 people. So that was great news to find out. What we'd like to do is now use that existing leach field potentially 400 or 500 people if we do a 430 student school with staff and all of that. And so the question to DEP was, first of all, can we add that population? And according to the regulations, you can't alter that septic system at all. And we know that by code, we would at least have to put in a grease trap. So would by putting in a grease trap, quote unquote, alter that septic system? I mean, if anything, it would make it function better. But we just need to make sure that DEP is okay with that arrangement.
Got it.
If they are, then we're great. Then we use that existing septic field. We would probably need a new well in any of the options. And so that cost was accounted for. That's a much, you know, it's still $100,000 or so, but it's much smaller than the septic issue. If we can't use that existing septic field, then because the senior high school and East Meadow are on the same site, according to DEP, that whole facility would need to have a wastewater treatment plant because of the size of the population there. So both the high school and East Meadow and whatever project we would do would have to feed into that.
And that would be on our dime, not,
And that would be on our dime. And so the rough costs were that it would be about $1 million in construction, permitting all of that to build that wastewater treatment site. And then I think he said $75,000 a year for someone to run it and the maintenance costs. So those were some of the numbers that were brought up at last week's meeting.
so is there value in us meeting either as a subcommittee or as a full committee next week? I mean,
I think we need that answer.
I would still want to meet, just to keep us in the loop and keep us going. And
And we can talk about our public outreach and our messaging and, you know, and we can discuss more about the actual buildings, not the numbers.
I agree with you, Andrea. I really think right now we're on a roll.
The more communication, the better. right?
We've been, this brought in a lot of data that I think is helping everybody really look at the options.
Right.
And maybe after a week of thinking, maybe we can have a better discussion on the various options too, or maybe put one of the old ones back in. Who knows?
Maybe, exactly.
Who knows?
I hate to say that.
I'm going to be honest.
But I agree. I agree. I hate going backwards.
John will say, I told you so.
I hate when people say that.
But,
You know, the nice part about meeting every week for 3 weeks now is that it's fresh in everybody's mind.
Yeah.
That, you know, after a month, it does get, what do we talk about? So
I mean, I'm agreeable to meeting, you know, next week and just doing what we can, even if it's just for an hour.
I'm done with that.
I'll come. It's not bad.
So we'll meet
I
next
don't want
week.
to take too many votes.
Next Thursday at
Same time.
6:30, not 6?
No, it's always 6:30.
I know originally though with outreach it was 6.
Well, there was confusion on paperwork too. One time, everybody was, well, some people were here at 6, some people at 6:30. There's been confusion.
Are you suggesting you want to try at 6? I mean,
No, I had written down
6:30 is
6,
good.
so.
So 6:30 we'll stick to.
Yeah.
But I always said 6:30.
And we'll try and keep it crisp and just keep the information flowing.
No, I always do 6:30 for our meeting and 7 o'clock for public comment.
And if we hear something from DEP in the meantime, we'll get the word to Chris and he can get that, out to everybody.
So before we break, I just want to ask, because I know you guys talked about this public outreach, we agreed to punt it out to
When we-
at some point.
Because we don't have all
Yeah,
the
we should have a direction before we go public outreach.
Right.
Okay.
This is just too much for the public to,
Right. Too much for us to
Yeah.
absorb too, so.
Right. But we're calling it a postponement, not a cancellation.
Right, correct.
So we'll define a date later. And
Yeah.
any other items for tonight before we break? You have a motion to close?
So moved.
Second.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.